Good afternoon. I'm Peter Bergen. I run the International Security Program at New America. It's my pleasure to introduce Becky Frankel, who has been a long-time friend of New America. We've known, you worked with us for, I don't know, 5 years at least. And Becky, as you know, has come out with War Dogs, which got rave reviews in the Washington Post and in other fora. And so she's going to talk about the big themes and stories in her book, and then we'll open up Q&A.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to have a small group. So I appreciate you coming in the middle of the day. So the book has been well received, and that's really nice for me, but I think it's even nicer because it's being shared by all of the handlers and the community that surrounds them, which is sort of a protective community. They are very committed and passionate about what they do, and I think that to be able to highlight not only what they do or not only their sort of harrowing stories, because I think people get very attached to the idea that, dogs are heroes, and certainly they are, but the difference they're making is very significant, and I take it very seriously, and I know they do too. So to have people be, coming to this topic in that way is a great thing. So this started in part with my work at Foreign Policy. I work with Tom Ricks, who is associated with Peter and the New America Foundation, and also is a wonderful guy and a very prominent and talented and dogged journalist. He was, the Iraq War correspondent for the Washington Post. He covered the Pentagon for the Wall Street Journal, and I started to work with him for The Best Defense. And as I got to know Tom, who has a sort of an intimidating presence, I think at first, as sort of a younger journalist, working with him, and I found out that he has these two very small dogs, and he loves them very, very much. And that was just sort of a way that we bonded, and it was a way that I got to know him, and it was through his dogs. And actually at the time I had a cat, and he wanted to hear nothing about it. He was not interested in my cat at all. So we just talked about his dogs. And one of my jobs at Foreign Policy is I do a lot of photo editing, and during that time, this was like 2008, a lot of the photos that were coming off the wire from Afghanistan and Iraq were war images, certainly, and those images are very gritty and sort of hard to look at. You become kind of accustomed to them, I think. And but one photo came across, and I saw it and sort of stopped and thought, I have to send this to Tom. And it was a picture of Marines in Helmand Province, and they were with their bomb-sniffing dogs at their barracks, which was essentially this very makeshift outside arrangement near, you could see the HESCO borders in the background, but they looked so happy. The dogs have these like huge smiles on their faces, and it was just such a contrast, such a stark contrast to everything else that I had been seeing. And so I sent it to him, and of course he got very excited about it and asked me to find some more, and I said, okay, sure, I'm happy to look for photos of dogs for you. And I found a lot more, and it's a very rich and deep subject, and it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and there are these little sort of gems, these little nuggets in history, and I was finding them, in papers from World War I reports to Vanity Fair or to the New York Times, and so we started to do the War Dog of the Week post, which led to this, which was wonderful.
Wasn't the most widely read story on FP of all time was?
Yes, for a long time running. I think one other piece has now surpassed it. But when the news about the Osama bin Laden mission came out in May 2011. There was this little piece in the report that there had been a dog on the mission, and they named the dog Cairo, and they said that the dog had been with the U.S. Navy SEALs. And that wasn't surprising to me at all, but people kind of went bananas over this news, and I thought, well, all right, fine, my boss at the time, Susan Glasser, said, well, just pull together some photos, and just do it. And I can say this to you, it's a small group, but I was actually supposed to go on vacation with a friend, and I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. I just want to go out of town, and I pulled together some photos and just tried to answer the question of why doesn't it surprise me, or why shouldn't it surprise the rest of us that there was a dog on this mission? And so I pulled together some photos, and it went viral, as they say, and I did not get to go on vacation, but I got to do a little bit of press, and it did very well for the magazine. And then the opportunity to write the book kind of came to me, even though Tom for a long time had been saying, oh, this should be a book. But I think the connection that I made with Tom over dogs actually proved to sort of be the path that I forged into this community that is so protective, that is so defensive of the work that they do and their dogs. Because I think a lot of time people from the outside might see the training that they do, which is intense. At times it's very, very, very physical and can be kind of rough. These dogs, some of them are, they weigh up to 100 pounds and they're very aggressive and they've got really sharp teeth and they're trained to do patrol work, which is bite work. And so they, the first trip that I went on was to Langley Air Force Base, a handler that I knew through I called him. I found a story about his kennels, which was at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, and he was touring the country giving these clinics to smaller teams of handlers through the Air Force. And the first time I went to watch them train, he told me later that he was really nervous about having me in the yard with them because he had to handle this one dog who sort of got worked up into a frenzy and couldn't be calmed down any other way but for him to become a little physical. And I thought it was funny because the whole time I wasn't watching him, but I was watching the dog, just to sort of see how the dog was reacting, and the dog was fine. So I didn't see that as abuse, but they are kind of standoffish a little bit until they sort of get that you get dogs and get that you get the work that they're doing. But I sort of found through my research and my reporting trips and these conversations that you have, even though you're talking about dogs, yes, you are still always talking about war. And I'm asking these men and women about the worst days possibly, hopefully, of their lives. They watched friends die, they had, IEDs explode in front of them, especially the Marines who went into Iraq in 2003 bore the worst brunt of sort of our unpreparedness to combat IEDs. And so, one Marine told me, that he had been blown up no less than 13 times in a period of 6 months. Wow. And of the Marines he went originally to Iraq with in 2003, only out of the 12 of them, I think only 10 of them had survived. 10 of them had been killed, only 2 of them had survived.
And were these EOD technicians?
No, they weren't.
Oh, they're dog handlers?
They weren't dog handlers, actually. Dog handlers didn't go into Iraq until 2004. It took them about a year for them to pull together, first the idea that they could be of use to them, and then because the dog teams that were first sent in, the ones that they deemed to be the sort of most ready for this kind of work, still weren't trained to track IEDs because nobody knew that they would need dogs to do that. They weren't anticipating this threat, at least in the way that I think they met with it once on the ground. So they had to sort of learn as they went. But if you were to ask a Vietnam handler who went to war with a dog, who used dogs for scouting on patrols, so it meant that the handlers and the dogs were out in front, and they used the dogs as sort of a measure for danger. So the way that they would do it is that there's a leash between the dog and the handler, and as long as the leash is taut, it means the dog is comfortable going forward. Once they perceive a threat of any kind, whether it's they're smelling ammunition, they're smelling guns, they're smelling humans, they're hearing noises in the trees, if maybe it's a sniper, they'll stop and then the leash goes slack. So in the dark, this is a very good way to judge whether or not you can move forward. It's a soundless, quiet way. So if you had asked a Vietnam handler in 2003, what they should be doing with the dogs, they could have told you exactly what they would have been good at. But unfortunately, Vietnam in particular, the dog program was disbanded, and mostly because they left the dogs there in Vietnam in sort of the haste to leave the country and the evacuation, which is a terrible chapter in our dog history, as it were. And many of these handlers are still very much traumatized. It's hard for them to talk about their dogs because they didn't know the dogs were being left behind. But in any event, so moving forward. But I found that talking to people about their dogs first was a way to establish a very solid connection, and that actually made it much easier to talk about war through talking about a dog. And that might seem simple, but it actually sort of worked. And I think it sort of, people have so much love for their dogs. If you're a dog lover, then of course you already know this, but and there's many reasons why humans connect more easily with canines than they do with other species. There's all these fantastic studies that have been done to show that in fact there is a bond and a sort of a biology between the species. So for example, we might take for granted that, you know, when you talk to your dog and you tell them, like, we're going to go for a walk, and they, of course, they know what you mean. You made a gesture, and they know what the leash means, and so, okay, they're at the door. That is communication. It's easy, it's simple, and you don't think about it. You didn't train them necessarily to understand that leash means walk, that they just know this. But in fact, it's actually not so unremarkable as that. You know, there's a woman in Sweden who conducted a study between communication between humans and chimps and humans and dogs. And you would think that chimps are much closer in terms of biology to humans than certainly dogs are. But in fact, it's much easier to communicate with a dog. So her experiment was she was sitting across from a chimp that knew her. They had sort of been in the clinic together for a long time. And she had three cups. And she took a piece of food, and she took a cup, and she put the food down, and she covered it with a cup. And so then she starts talking to the chimp, and she said, the food is here. Here's the food, and she's using her voice, and she's gesturing, and her face is also communicating, and the chimp is doing anything but listening to her. She's picking up the cups, and she's looking around, but at no point is there any sense that one is sort of reading off the other. And then it flashes to the same experiment, but this time with a dog, and the food is on the floor. And she walks into the room, and from the minute she comes into the room, the dog is focused on her. He's looking at her, he's tracking her, and she says, the food is here. She says the dog's name, like, you know, Rex, the food is here. And he goes right to where she shows him. And maybe he smelled it, but, you know, because dogs do have incredible sensory powers, their noses are amazing. But in fact, you know, the dog was listening to her, was communicating with her.
Didn't Anderson Cooper do a form of this experiment on 60 Minutes a few months ago?
I don't know. I might have missed it.
Yeah.
Did he with the dog?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he's testing, improving the theory then, I guess.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, so for me that was really sort of a profound realization that actually there is so much more to this that seems so natural and simple between humans and dogs. Which I think just sort of resonates to why human-to-human contact through this thread of a dog and through the love and affinity we have for dogs makes talking about war a little bit easier. And so that was an interesting part of the book for me. Also, something that was surprising was to find out that a lot of the handlers had a hard time, even if they could talk about how much they love their dogs, it was very hard for some of them to use the word. I think that part of it might come from the training. The older school of training is always, you know, you're not supposed to get attached to your dog. You know, don't treat your dog like a pet. And certainly that is important. When the dogs are working, they're working. Just like when you're working, you're working. You can, you know, it's easier to do your job if you're focused solely on the task at hand, and same for a dog. But I was very surprised that when I actually asked the question, you know, so do you think your dog loves you then? And some of them said, no, they don't. I said, well, we were just talking 5 minutes ago about how you lost your first dog and how it was the first time you cried in front of your, you know, the men and women that you work with, and how hard it is for you still to think about them, but you don't think that that's about love. And they would say no, and they rely oftentimes on this sort of alpha wolf pack speak, which is I think still pretty common in training dogs. And we rely on the model of a wolf pack, which I think originally it was the idea that there was the alpha and then the betas who sort of fall in line behind the one wolf. But if you read a little bit more about some of the recent writings on dogs, they look at wolf packs not as hierarchies, but actually as families. So the relationships are really more about bonding and loving than sort of following the leader. So this was sort of what I came away with. Of course, you know, handlers and dogs, the emotion exchanged, you know, is love. It's whether it's familial or, you know, a bond between friends. It is, even if you can't use the word, then it is very much about connecting. And I also found that, you know, the dogs and the handlers that seemed closer performed better, which to me would be something you'd think that they would want to foster. Because if we are relying again on this sort of understanding that dogs and humans have this unique ability to communicate, doesn't it seem to make more sense then that the closer they are, the better their communication is, and the better they will perform as a team. And I learned this lesson very viscerally on my own, because at one training exercise I went to, I spent a week in Colorado, and I went to a bunch of different military bases there. And at at Buckley Air Force Base, I was watching a number of different teams do a number of different searches. They were searching for drugs, and they were searching for explosives. And so we get to this bathroom, and one of the sergeants says, "Okay, Rebecca, you know, it's your turn." And I was very comfortable just sort of hanging out in the back and taking pictures and writing notes and being very quiet. And they said, no, it's your turn. You're going to find the bomb. And so they gave me the leash to this dog. It's named Haas. He was a German short-haired pointer. And we had been getting along very well. Haas was a really gentle dog. He was people-friendly. And so we'd been hanging out, and I thought, okay, well, this might not be so bad. I think I can do this. I've been watching all of these handlers for hours. We'd been doing this. And I was studying them very closely, so I thought, okay. And I was a little bit nervous because it was me and about 12 other kind of big dudes, and they were all going to watch me in this very brightly lit bathroom. And so I took the leash, and that was it. They just said, find the bomb. So I thought, okay, I can do this. And so I get into the bathroom, and I tell Haas, I say, seek. And I tell him, you know, I point to the door seam, the seam where the wall meets the floor, which is how you conduct your search. So you go clockwise around the room. And he did it. He followed me, and I thought, okay, so here we go. And he's moving very fast, because these are not slow searches, right? Like, if there really is a bomb in this bathroom, then you want to find it, and you want to find it very fast. So Haas just takes off and goes. And we go to the sink, and I, you know, tell him to hop up, and he gets up on not all the way up, but he puts his front paws in the sink, and then we're doing pretty well. And then we hit the bathroom stalls. And so the first one was fine. I managed to open the door, and I got him to go around sort of the toilet, and I'm in there with him, and it's crowded, but he gets out, and then he shoots out ahead of me, and he goes to the third one instead of the second one, so I have to pull him back. And then we get into the second one, and he gets all tangled up in the leash, and then I get tangled up in the leash, and I could hear them snickering in the doorway, and I could feel my face getting red, but I was like, I'm not going to give up, I'm not going to give up. And so we get to the second stall, and then we come out, and it happens, the tangling happens all over again. And the bathroom door hit me in the back, and it really hurt. And I just thought in my head, I can't do this. And I was still, at the moment while I was saying that, I was still giving the motions. I was still telling Haas to go forward, and he just stopped right there and sat in the middle of the floor, and he looked over at the guys in the door, and he was like, no, she can't do this. And he really exposed me. And it was a very quick lesson, because a number of things that they had been telling me all the way up until this point, I had been listening to, but I had not been absorbing. And those things are, one, the emotions run up and down the leash. That's something handlers say all the time. So when you get frustrated, your dog is going to feel that you get frustrated. If you're nervous, your dog might be nervous. But also, it works the other way too. So if your dog is sensing danger, then you should be able to sort of feel that. And also, if a dog doesn't trust you, they're not going to follow you. You know, that they're very intelligent animals. They know how to do the job they're supposed to do. And Haas was like, you don't know what you're doing. That's it. I'm done.
What are the breeds of choice?
So mostly right now, the United States military uses German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois. Yeah. And the reasons for that are German Shepherds are very intelligent dogs, which means that if you're a handler for a German Shepherd, you have to keep them engaged. You can't have a rote sort of like we do the same training all the time because they're going to get bored, or they're going to think ahead of you and know that, okay, I know if I sit down and alert, you're going to give me my toy, which is sort of their driving ambition there. And the Belgian Malinois have this crazy high work drive. I mean, these dogs could work and work and work and work until they drop. They just...
Cairo was a Belgian Malinois.
So they say, yes.
Yeah.
Although I've heard off the record that his name is not Cairo.
Okay.
But
Well, let's assume that his name was Cairo
Yeah.
for the moment. What was he doing? What was he supposed to be doing?
So I would guess that what he was doing is probably there. So Special Forces dogs are trained a little bit differently. You know, there's no record of them, of course, on what they do. And I was able to watch one.
They have covert identities.
They do. They do. And so I got to know some veterinarians stationed in Bagram, really a team of 3. They were really wonderful. And they saw all the dogs that came through Afghanistan. And they would tell me, you know, they told me how many Special Forces dogs they had, but there were no records of them kept necessarily. And when they were killed, no record is kept of how many dogs are killed. So that was actually one thing that was really hard for me to do, was to determine how many dogs have been killed since we started in Iraq, because while records are kept, each branch keeps their own records. They all keep them differently. Some of them will put down a cause of death, some of them won't. And so it's complicated. But what Cairo would have been doing, I would have guessed, is possibly there for helping to detain anyone who might have tried to flee on foot. Because if you've ever watched any of these bite trainings, you know, these dogs, if somebody is running at a great speed and the dogs chase them down, the momentum that catches when they connect and when they hit, it's unbelievable how hard they go down. And actually, that was something else I did in training. I got into the bite suit and I went and got bit. And I was wearing not the thickest jacket, because those are really enormous, and so it didn't fit me, so I couldn't wear it. But the one that I was wearing, they said, no, you're not going to feel anything. Like they train the dogs to catch people like right here on their arms, or right here on their chest, or on their legs. But this is the best way to, if they're chasing someone at a high speed and they catch them here and go down, it's very easy for them, right? They can pull the person down. Whereas if they were to hit their legs, they might stop them, but not totally knock them off their feet. And so, I felt it. I felt every bit of it, and it really hurt. And I had a bruise afterwards, and I've seen some of the bruises on these, you know, these like really big, broad, muscular arms, and they're like this big. They're huge, and it looks like, you know, somebody sort of just painted it black. My bruise was very big for me, but it was not. It was like, you know, a paper cut compared to like a gunshot wound. It was nothing to complain about, but if I can't imagine what that would feel like without anything.
Talk us through the reporting process. I mean, did you do this big literature review about dogs, and then dogs in the military, and then where did you travel to, and how did?
So I went to a bunch of different military bases only here in the United States, and for me it was more about where I knew people. I tried to avoid at all costs going through the military's public affairs office. While I certainly appreciate and respect the work that they do, you know, if you want to really know anything about how this works, you go right to the source. You don't want someone sort of walking around making sure you're not asking certain questions, and so. And
they didn't have to go through their public affairs to do this?
I didn't. I ended up not being able to. I always had permission to be where I was, but there was at one point, well, off the record, I will say that at one point I was able to go watch something I didn't have permission to do, and I did have to hide in a van for a little while. But the reason why I think that they allowed me to do this is because I really was, first and foremost, interested in educating myself. I wanted to know everything that they were willing to show me, and so if they said, we start, you know, PT at 5 a.m., and I would say, okay, I'll be here at 4:45, and you know, I didn't leave until they left at night. And
are the trainers mostly men?
They are mostly men. It is the military. You know, there's a lot of ego and machismo, and certainly there is that in the dog handling field. A lot of handlers like to talk about, you know, who's got the baddest dog and whose dog bites the hardest. You know, it's a thing, you know, they talk about it. but the handlers I found were to be the ones, at least, that I gravitated towards, were the ones who would say things like, "You're never done learning. You can learn from everyone." You know.
Are there people who go into this field? That's what they're going to do.
A lot of them that I met wanted to, you know, work with dogs in either a police force capacity, which, you know, it's very hard to have a long career in dog handling in the military. There's only a few rungs to climb, and then once you get to the top, you kind of can't.
What is the top rank?
Kennel master.
What's that?
Kennel master.
Okay, and is that what is that rank equivalent of?
I think it's like an E4 or 5. I'm not sure. But
it's enlisted, or is it an off? I mean, is it?
So the dog handling community in the military is like a microcosm of the larger military, so it's very small. It's very, very small. Even though I think that it is important to acknowledge how big an impact such a small community is having across the broader, especially in combat zones. But it's like any job field, right? The higher you go, the finer the point is at the top, and so those opportunities are fewer and further between. And but not all of them are enlisted at that point. But I think it's very rare to get a high-ranking position like that and have retired out of the military.
So, how is you've had all these great reviews. You've gone around the country. I mean, I'm looking to throw it open to anybody for questions, unless you've got something else you wanted to say. Or?
I mean, I can talk about this forever, so I'd rather
okay,
talk about what people are interested in.
So, like, you know, what has been the overall response? I mean, we were talking earlier. I mean, you got this big Venn diagram of the military, which is a big group, and people, and then big group of people who love dogs, and the sort of like this group in the center. But they're the people. You tell me what you just told me earlier before when we walked out to lunch.
You know, it's definitely a mix. A lot of what I've enjoyed a lot in doing these sort of talks and then meeting people. One couple, you know, when you're giving a talk or you're talking to a group of people and you're sort of looking and making eye contact. There was this one couple and they were sitting in the back and they just were so happy. They were just so happy, and then they came up to me afterwards, and it turns out that their son had been a handler in Afghanistan. He just finished his service, I think, with the Marines, and he's okay, but he has his dog, and he loves his dog, and they felt like, you know, they wouldn't have wanted to have sent him without the dog. They felt like the dog kept him safe, and that they, you know, would have done anything for this dog, you know, that they're so grateful and thankful, and those kinds of things are nice. I was in Tampa or St. Petersburg rather, a couple of weeks ago. They had a book fair, and I hadn't expected this, so I wasn't really prepared for it, and I wish I had sort of replied a little bit differently, but this man came up, and he didn't say anything. He just handed me a Post-it note and his book that he wanted signed, and on the note it just said Rex, and it had a number, and I knew that meant it's the ID number, the tattoo number that they put in the dog's ear, like their dog tag. And I realized by his age, of course, that he had been in Vietnam, and I had been talking in the talk about what had happened to this one handler and how he tried for years and years to find his dog, and how, you know, this still sort of rattles him, and to know that she had been killed and without him being there, without knowing, it just is like this thing that haunts him. And this man didn't say anything to me. He just sort of handed me his book, and I said, "This was your dog?" And he just sort of said yes, and he was, I think, kind of overwhelmed with emotion, and so that means a lot to me to have those kinds of meetings. But what I was telling Peter is that a woman wrote me an email and said there was too much swearing in my book, and that she couldn't get through the first chapter and had to return it to the library. So I thought, all right, fair enough.
But I mean, you're also saying, you know, I mean, people who have an interest in the military have a strong interest, and people who have an interest in dogs have a strong interest. So it's like these two communities that are pretty intense.
The enthusiasm is extreme, and that's kind of a wonderful thing to know, that, you know, people who care about something so much are finding value, because it means then that if, you know, like anyone who's a diehard fan of any, you know, sort of niche topic, that you consume as much as you can. So I'm sure they've already read all the wonderful books on this topic, or read just wonderful books about dogs, and there are so many of them. I have a huge dog library now, dog book library, I should say.
What are the best books on dogs?
On dogs in general, I was particularly drawn to Mark Durr's books. He's written for The Atlantic before. I talked to him for hours. He's a really interesting man, but he wrote a book called The Dog's History of America, which is fascinating. He's a very intelligent writer, and he has these wonderful little stories about, dogs all the way through. And he writes about how Columbus used dogs and to very horrific degrees as sort of
hunting people down.
Yeah, and using them to kill people. So, not a great guy, Columbus.
Do you have thoughts about what your next project might be?
I do have some.
Is it going to be in the canine field?
I certainly came across many. You go sort of down these rabbit holes, and I was really particularly interested in World War I. Some of the best books on animals and war, I think, came out of that time period. Baines is the last name. Ernest Harold Baines, I think, is his name. He wrote a book called Animals in the Great War, and it's
he's
just
British.
Yes.
So it's like a perfect storm.
Yes.
The British love dogs, and they love the First World War. And
absolutely, and it's written in sort of each wartime has its own sort of
vernacular.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but the World War II, it's sort of there's a lot of Nancy Drew type writing, so it's like, golly gee, this dog was great, and World War I, it was very gentlemanly, sort of archaic vocabulary, but they're wonderful, and the stories are wonderful. But there are so this Vietnam handler, Ron Aiello, that I interviewed, who brought his dog Stormy to Vietnam. He was a Marine. He goes to these handler reunions every few years for the Vietnam guys, and maybe about 10 years ago they were having one in New Jersey somewhere, and so they all got together, his group of friends that have stayed in touch, and they went to New Jersey, and they realized that it was a reunion for World War II handlers, that they had just not paid attention to the flyers or something, and it just sort of ended up there by accident. And he said, we'll just sort of stay. And he said they ended up staying in one hotel room with a bunch of guys, or in some part of their hotel, for almost 24 hours together, almost the whole time, just telling stories. And he said, in the end, it didn't really make a difference that it wasn't the same war, because the stories were sort of the same. So I think that is definitely true.
Anybody has a question? Sir?
Hi.
How many people, I'm with VOA. How many dogs are currently in active duty, and do they use these dogs to breed new dogs for war dogs?
So the United States Military Working Dog Program is the overseeing branch is the Air Force. So the sort of main hub is at San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. And they have the dog training school there. They have the big veterinary hospital there that they call the Walter Reed for Dogs. And then they have the breeding program there. So they breed Belgian Malinois, and they have a litter. They have lots of litters. They all get assigned a letter. So they have a double consonant, double letter before, at the beginning of every name. So the R litter had Ruck and Risky, and they RRISKY. So they do. And currently right now, the entire program has about 1,200 dogs, I think. But these are not dogs in combat zones. These are dogs, stationed at any base, any military base around the world, the United States military base. So the numbers are much fewer than they were about 5 years ago. They're drawing down the canine forces. There's a draw down.
So?
Peter Jewell, I'm from Center for American Progress, more here in my capacity as a dog person. So, so building off of that question, why the Air Force? And my main question is, what's the sort of the career path for the dog, and what happens to the dog when he or she gets mustered out of military service?
Yeah. I don't actually know why the Air Force took over as sort of the overseeing branch. I would think that it would have been the Marines, but possibly because the Marines are much smaller in terms of, particularly in terms of the canine program. The way that they use dogs is a little bit, not in their capacity in sort of a day-to-day job, but in terms of when we enter a conflict, how the Marines, they sort of, tip of the spear go in.
Yeah. So
it's a good question that I don't have an answer to. So in terms of a dog's career path rather, dogs operate very differently. They get assigned to a home station and they don't leave unless they're transferred for a particular reason. And so it's the handlers that kind of come in. They cycle in and out as they move to their different assignments. But a dog and a handler always deploy together and they return to the home station together. And then if a dog gets assigned a new handler, then the process always takes place at the home station. But it really depends on the dog, sort of maybe just like any other individual in the military. Some dogs have longer working careers, working lives than others. They just weather it better. But it's a harder life, you know. So some of these dogs start aging out. They can age out as early as 9. But some of them are in their whole lives. So, but when it is time for a dog to sort of finish their military service, then what happens is there's a review process, and the veterinarian in charge of the dog who looks at the whole. So dog records are mostly kept through the veterinary records, and then they have sort of their training records. So they look at training records, they look at the veterinary records, the handler, the kennel master of the home station, and a behaviorist comes in and sort of looks at the dog to make sure that if they're going to retire into a home, what kind of home is most suitable for them. So can they be in a home with other dogs? Can they be in a home with young children? You know.
What is the answer usually?
A lot of them do go into regular homes, but some of them, you know, it's a matter of safety. So they're too aggressive, or they have sort of triggers, and you know, they're too one-person protective. So, and it sort of all depends.
I was curious about the photograph on the cover of the book.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that dog is happy. Go on.
Genesis of the photograph.
Yeah, so this is actually, I believe, from a training exercise. My publisher picked that one. But it's sort of, they do the rappelling sometimes from helicopters. So the photo that kind of launched the viralness of that Osama bin Laden.
It's a very famous picture.
It became one, yes.
Right, and did you launch that?
I think so. I mean, certainly I didn't take the photo, but
Well, tell me what it looks like. Tell everybody what it looks like. It's a very famous picture.
Yeah, so it's taken from the back of a Chinook helicopter, and you see presumably the handler and a dog, and they're launching into the water, and you kind of see the dog in midair. And when I first saw the photo, I called a few handlers that I knew, and I said, you know, tell me what's going on here. And is this dog going on his own? And some of them said, no, he probably had some help. But then a year later, I decided to track down the photographer and like get the story behind the photo. And I found him, and we talked for a while. And he said that it was just a lucky shot that this was at the end. The dog and the handler were the last ones of the guys to take their jump. And what I hadn't realized, if you look out into the water, you see these little tiny like ghostly figures, and it's men in the water, and they're going like this. They're cheering the dog on. And he said that the dog went on his own, the handler went, and the dog went. But you can Google these things. There's a lot of handlers that will they take jump out of airplanes with their dogs. They get strapped in. They teach them to do this, and so you sort of I wouldn't jump out of a plane on my own accord. Maybe if it was going down and somebody wanted to like give me a push, I would go. But so I don't really understand the thrill in that, but. You see them go down, and the dog's got a muzzle on, and he's just kind of hanging. The handler's hanging onto them.
Does the dog have its own parachute, or
no? He's strapped into the handler.
Right.
So they get strapped in like this, and so they sort of cradle them, and then you see what happens when they get on the ground, and these dogs are like just running around crazy. They're so excited. And then in another one I watched, it was kind of awesome. It was a handler who had. Been in an IED explosion, and he had to have his feet amputated. So this video is of him taking his first jump with his dog after sort of healing up, and you can see the dog knows exactly where they're going. He's like the way, you know, maybe not to the vet, but like if you're going for a ride in the car with the dog, and the dog likes to stick his head out the window, it's sort of the same thing. So he just can't wait to get on. He lets himself get strapped in. So you have to imagine some of them really do love doing this, even if, you know, some people wouldn't want to.
Gentlemen.
What's your favorites?
What's your favorite story of a dog and a handler that you've come across?
There are
Too many.
So many. Good you know, I was thinking about this other day because somebody asked me and I didn't have a good answer ready. But something, and I still actually tear up every time I read it, amazingly. It's this, Napoleon wrote about coming across a dog. He wrote about it years later when he was in exile, sort of looking back on this experience. And he talks about going into the field after they've sort of devastated this battalion of men, and there are just bodies all over the place. And there was this one dog, and he was sitting by the body of whoever he had been attached to. And when he saw these people come in, the dog got very excited and kept running up to Napoleon and then running back to the man on the ground and like licking his hand. And basically Napoleon was saying that he was clearly imploring him for help. And he said that, you know, in writing about this, he said it was the most moving experience he'd ever had in battle, that at no other time in all the lives they laid to waste fighting that he ever felt so ready to show mercy on the enemy than he did at this dog. So I just, it just resonated in a way that sort of all of these stories have in the middle of them this very sort of bare tenderness to them. I think because dogs offer their service so unconditionally, and their attachment.
They can also be manipulated for quite evil purposes. Then the Nazis used dogs for fairly frequently for rounding people up. And
yes, they did. And I think in understanding that, you have to sort of understand that it's not the dogs that
right.
are evil,
Yeah,
certainly.
right,
And that what they're doing is just
following orders.
following orders, exactly. Which might ring a little bit lame,
Yeah.
but it's true.
Any other questions? Okay, well, Becky, thank you very much
Yeah,
for this
thank
wonderful
you.
presentation. I'm sure you'll be be willing to sign books.
Oh, if anyone has one they want me to sign.
Thank
of
you,
course.
Becky, very, very
Oh,
much.
thank you. Thank you for